She walked into that hotel lobby carrying a broken suitcase held together with a bungee cord, wearing a coat 2 sizes too big, and not a single person behind that front desk looked up. He was sitting in the corner pretending to read a newspaper, watching all of it. Neither of them knew that her 5-minute decision to stop and help a stranger would cost her the one thing she had spent 4 years working toward, and that the man in the corner was the reason it happened. The Pembroke Grand was the kind of hotel that made people feel like they'd done something wrong just by walking in. 60-foot ceilings, a chandelier that had been in travel magazines, marble imported from somewhere that took 3 sentences to explain. The staff wore matching navy blazers with gold pins that said their name and their department like they were ambassadors of a small, important country. Elliot was not dressed like a guest. He was in a worn flannel jacket, jeans with a fraying hem, and boots that had seen 4 Canadian winters without being replaced. His hair needed cutting. There was a canvas duffel bag at his feet that had a broken zipper held shut with a carabiner clip. He had checked in under the name of a company he'd registered 3 years ago for exactly this kind of thing. A numbered company. Something clean and forgettable. He had been doing this for 2 years. Walking into properties he owned or was considering acquiring, moving through them as someone who had nothing. Watching what the people he paid chose to do when they thought no one important was watching. He had learned more about the character of his managers in 48 hours this way than he had in 6 months of reports and quarterly reviews. He had also, twice, found people he later promoted directly to senior positions. Both of them had stopped to help him with something small. Neither of them had known who he was. He was not hopeful today. The Pembroke Grand had been struggling. Not financially. It was profitable, had been for years, running on reputation and location alone. But something in the last 18 months had gone wrong at the level of culture. Guest complaints had doubled. Staff turnover was up 30%. 3 separate incidents involving front desk personnel had been flagged and quietly settled. His regional manager, a man named Derek, who wore his confidence like a life jacket, had assured him repeatedly that these were isolated. Elliot had stopped believing Derek 6 months ago, but hadn't yet figured out what was underneath it. So he was sitting in a lobby armchair with a newspaper he wasn't reading, watching the front desk. There were 4 staff on rotation. 2 of them he had already clocked. A young man who had twice rolled his eyes at guests, who lingered too long at the counter, and a woman who had told a family with 2 toddlers to use the side entrance, because the main doors were for regular traffic. The other 2 were more careful, or at least more practiced at performing care, without actually delivering it. At 2:17 in the afternoon, a woman came through the main doors. She was in her late 20s, maybe 30. Dark hair pulled back, good posture in the way that looked earned rather than trained. She was wearing a blazer that was clean and pressed but clearly older, and she had the kind of careful put-togetherness that said, "I know exactly what I'm walking into and I prepared for it." Her suitcase handle had snapped at some point, and she'd looped a bungee cord through the frame to keep it closed. She was carrying a leather portfolio under her other arm. She walked straight to the front desk. She didn't look around or hesitate. "Hi, I'm Dara Osei," she said clearly. "I have a 2:30 interview. Hospitality and Operations Management. I was told to check in at the front desk and wait." The man behind the counter, the eye roller, glanced at her, then at her suitcase, then back at his screen. "Take a seat," he said, and gestured at the chairs without looking up. Dara nodded and walked toward the seating area near the window. She set her suitcase down carefully, sat and opened her portfolio. She had a pen in her hand before she even settled. She was reviewing notes, reading through something. Her lips moved slightly. Elliot watched her. 2 women in blazers near the concierge station were watching her too, but differently. He couldn't hear everything they said. They were too far, and their voices were low enough to be intentional about it. But he caught enough. One of them looked at the bungee cord on the suitcase and said something to the other that made the other one press her lips together to stop smiling. Dara did not look over. She just sat with her portfolio open and her pen moving, like she was in a study hall, like none of the rest of it existed. There was something in how still she was that caught at something in Elliot's chest. Not performance, not pretending not to notice, just refusing to let it matter. She had somewhere to be and she was going to be ready for it. At 2:22, the revolving door opened, and a woman came in struggling badly. She was elderly, maybe 75, small and bird-like, and she had too many bags. A rolling case, a canvas tote on each shoulder, a purse looped over her wrist, and the rolling case had caught a wheel on the lip of the door, and she was stuck, half in and half out, one bag sliding off her shoulder. No one behind the desk moved. The concierge station women glanced over and then back at each other. Elliot got up. He was 2 steps toward the door when Dara was already there. She had crossed the lobby in the time it took him to stand. She was talking to the woman quietly, getting a hand under the tilting bag, pulling the suitcase wheel free from the door seam, holding it steady. The elderly woman said something, and Dara laughed. A real laugh, short and warm. She walked the woman all the way to the front desk, set the rolling case in front of the counter, said something to the desk clerk that Elliot could not hear, but which involved a pointed look that clearly communicated several things at once. Then she walked back to her seat. She opened her portfolio again. Elliot sat back down. He watched the clock above the elevator bank. 2:30 came. 2:32. 2:35. At 2:38, the concierge station woman, the one who had been close-mouthed about the suitcase, name tag reading Hather, Department. Guest experience, walked to the seating area. Miss Osi? Dara looked up immediately. I'm sorry, there's been a scheduling issue. The panel ran long with an earlier candidate. They're asking everyone to check in again at the desk and confirm they're still available, or we can reschedule. Dara looked at her. Something moved across her face. Calculation, maybe, or restraint. I'm still available, she said. I'll check in. She stood and walked to the desk. What happened at the desk, Elliot would piece together from 3 different points of observation over the next 8 minutes. The clerk took her name, pulled something up, said something. Dara went still. The clerk said something else. Dara's hand on the counter tightened once and then released. She walked back to her seat and sat down. She did not open the portfolio this time. Elliot waited until Heather had gone back to the concierge station, and then he got up and walked across the lobby slowly, like someone going to look at the travel brochure rack. Near the window, he stopped a few feet away from Dara and pretended to read something about Banff. He heard her breathing, slow and controlled. The kind of breathing that was not natural, that you had to choose. They moved on, she said, without looking at him. She must have clocked him in her peripheral vision, or heard him, or just felt the pause of someone nearby who wasn't moving. They said the panel couldn't wait past the window. A beat. I was 3 minutes late checking back in. I was at the front desk helping her. She didn't say the rest. She didn't need to. Elliot looked at the brochure. He said, I saw. She looked over at him then. He was just a man in a flannel jacket holding a pamphlet about mountain scenery. She studied his face for a second the way people do when they're deciding whether to keep talking. I needed this job, she said. It wasn't a complaint. It was just a fact. The same way you'd say the weather was cold. What's the job? Regional Operations Manager. Which I know sounds like I'm reaching, but I have 4 years in hospitality management, and this property is. She stopped, pressed her lips together. It doesn't matter now. Why operations management? Elliot asked. She looked at him like the question surprised her. Because the problems in hotels like this aren't usually the rooms. They're the culture. Who the front desk is when no one they think matters is watching. She said it plainly and then seemed to catch herself. Sorry, I've been sitting here with a lot of thoughts. Don't apologize, he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she zipped up the portfolio and stood, lifted the bungee-corded suitcase, straightened her blazer. Good luck with your trip, she said, nodding at his duffel bag. She walked out through the revolving door. Elliot stood with the Banff brochure in his hand for a long moment. Then he went upstairs to the room he'd checked into under a numbered company and sat at the desk by the window and thought about what she'd said. The problems aren't usually the rooms. They're the culture. He picked up his phone. There was something else underneath the Pembroke's problems that he had been circling for months without landing on. Something that Derek's quarterly reports consistently managed to not say. He had 2 weeks of observations left. He had a list of staff performance concerns that had grown to 19 items. He had an instinct that had taken him 12 years and 2 companies to learn to trust. He closed the phone and thought about Dara Ose instead. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected the way she sat down and opened her portfolio again, after being mocked quietly by two women, who were supposed to represent guest experience. He hadn't expected her to be the first person moving toward the door, when the elderly woman got stuck. He hadn't expected her to articulate the core failure of his flagship property in one sentence while sitting in its lobby, having just lost the interview she'd come for. He opened his laptop. He typed her name into the application portal he'd had his HR team build 2 years ago, the one where every application to every Harland Group property in the country went. He was looking to see if she'd applied anywhere else. She hadn't. She'd applied only here. He clicked through to her file, read her resume, read her cover letter, read the note the reviewing manager had left on her file. Candidate arrived late to confirmation window. Panel moved on per protocol. He sat with that for a while. His father had built the Harland Group from 2 motels outside of Thunder Bay. He had worked every department himself before he ever hired for them. He'd said once that the people worth having were the ones who did the right thing when it cost them something. Not when it was easy. Not when someone was watching. When it cost them. Elliot had not always understood that. He did now. He requested her full application file and marked it for personal review. Then he closed the laptop, got up, and stood at the window looking out at the Halifax waterfront for a long time. He had a board meeting in 3 days. He had a regional manager who had been lying to him by omission for the better part of a year. He had a property with a culture problem he could now name precisely, and a growing list of staff who embodied that problem in different sizes and varieties. And he had just watched the best answer to all of it walk out the revolving door with a bungee cord on her suitcase. The board meeting was on the 31st floor of a building in downtown Halifax. Derek arrived early, as he always did, in a suit that said serious and shoes that said expensive and an expression that said absolutely nothing was wrong. He had 4 regional managers with him, all of whom had been CC'd on a memo. Derek had circulated 4 days prior. Elliot had been CC'd too. He had read it twice. The memo raised concerns about strategic direction, about the pace of change, about whether certain decisions at the ownership level were aligned with market realities. It did not name Elliot directly. It didn't need to. Derek shook hands around the table. He was good with a room. Elliot had watched him do it for 2 years, and still felt the pull of it, the warmth, the confidence, the sense that this was a man who knew what he was doing and what everyone around him was doing, and that all of it was going to be fine. The doors opened. Elliot walked in. No flannel jacket. No duffel bag with a broken zipper. A dark gray suit, precisely fitted, the kind that didn't announce itself. He walked to the head of the table like someone who knew every square foot of the building because he did. He'd bought it 7 years ago and kept his ownership on a numbered holding company, which was why Derek had apparently forgotten, or chosen to forget who he was sitting across from. Elliot. Derek's smile held, barely. I didn't know you'd be attending in person. I know, Elliot said. He sat. He looked around the table once. Then he opened a folder and slid copies to each person present. 18 months of guest complaints, he said. Staff turnover data broken down by property and department. 3 flagged incidents involving front desk personnel at the Pembroke Grand, 2 of which Derek's team resolved without formal HR documentation, which is how they didn't appear in any of the reports I received. He let that land. And a culture assessment I conducted personally over the past 11 days. Silence. Derek looked at the papers, then up. A culture assessment, he repeated. I was on property last week, and the week before. Elliot looked at him evenly. I was in the lobby on Tuesday afternoon. Something shifted in Derek's face. It was small and it was fast, and he covered it immediately with the practiced warmth. Elliot, if there were concerns, the appropriate channel, Elliot said, told me for 6 consecutive quarters that everything was fine. He opened a second folder. This one had names. Dates. Specific incidents, time-stamped and described. 2 of the names appeared multiple times. One of them was Heather Guest Experience. Another was the front desk clerk, who had told a family with toddlers to use the side door. Derek's voice had changed. The warmth was still technically present, but something underneath it had shifted, like a floor that wasn't level. I want to be clear that the incidents you're describing were handled at the property level, by the same people who created them, Elliot said. Yes, I know. The room was very quiet. I built the Harland Group on one principle, Elliot said. It's not complicated. Treat the person in front of you like they matter. Not because they might be important. Because they are. That's it. He closed the folder. What I observed at the Pembroke last week was a property where that principle has been systematically replaced by something else, and the reporting structure that should have told me that chose not to. Derek started to say something. There will be a full audit, Elliot said. Third party. It starts Monday. I'm also bringing in a new operations lead at the Pembroke, reporting directly to me, not to the regional structure, while the audit runs. Derek went still. That would functionally bypass. Yes, Elliot said. It would. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. Derek's 4 regional managers left quickly. Derek himself stayed a few seconds longer, standing by the window looking at the harbor. I've given 12 years to this company, he said. I know, Elliot said. So did I. Derek left. Elliot stood alone at the window. The harbor was gray-green in the afternoon light. Container ships lined up in the distance like a sentence. He thought about his father, who had sat in an office not unlike this one 22 years ago, and told him, the work will always tell you what it needs. Listen to the work. He had been listening. He just hadn't liked what it said until now. He picked up his phone and called his director of people and culture, a woman named Sandra, who had been with the company for 8 years, and who answered on the first ring. I need you to pull a candidate file, he said. Name is Dara Osi. She applied to the Pembroke Grand last Tuesday. She was removed from consideration because she was late to a confirmation window. Sandra was quiet for a moment. I see the file. The panel moved on. I need you to reach her. Today if possible. Explain that the role has evolved and we'd like to speak with her again. Directly. Tell her the conversation will be with me. Another beat. Directly with you. Yes. Sandra did not ask why. That was part of why she had lasted 8 years. I'll reach out this afternoon, she said. Elliot hung up. He looked at the harbor for a while longer. He didn't know what Dara Ose would say. She had every reason to decline. She had walked out of that lobby with something careful in the set of her shoulders. The kind of careful that meant she had done the math on what had just happened and filed it away. And was already thinking about what came next. She was not, he suspected, someone who spent much time waiting for things to get better on their own. He hoped she hadn't already moved on. She almost didn't come. Sandra reached her at 4:15. Dara listened to the entire explanation without interrupting, which Sandra told Elliot afterward was not a common response. Most people interrupted. They asked questions, sought reassurance. Dara had listened to the whole thing and then said quietly, the role evolved how? Sandra had said she didn't have those details, but that Elliot Harland himself had requested the conversation. There was a pause. I'll come, Dara said, but I want it noted that my interview last week was disrupted because I stopped to help a guest in your lobby. Sandra had noted it. The second meeting was not in a lobby or a glass-walled conference room. It was in Elliot's office on the 31st floor, which had a view of the harbor and a coffee table, with 2 chairs and a standing lamp that had been there since his father's day, and that Elliot had never replaced, because it was the one piece of furniture that made the room feel like somewhere a person actually lived. Dara came in wearing the same blazer, different shirt. She had the portfolio again. She stopped when she saw him. It took her 3 seconds. He counted. The man in the flannel jacket. The Banff brochure. You were in the lobby, she said. Yes. With the broken duffel bag. Gup. The zipper's been broken for a year. I keep meaning to fix it. She looked at him for a long moment. He waited. He had learned, was still learning, that most things worth knowing came out in the waiting, if you could stand to do it. You own the hotel, she said. I own the group that owns the hotel. 11 properties across Atlantic Canada and Ontario. She sat down. Not because he just sat like someone who needed a moment to recalibrate and was comfortable doing it visibly. The interview, she said. That was a test. I test properties, he said. Not candidates. You weren't supposed to be part of it. But I was in the lobby when you were testing it. Yes. She looked at the harbor through the window. He waited again. My sister has been covering my rent for the past 2 months, she said finally. While I've been interviewing. She doesn't say anything about it. Just transfers the money and texts me something stupid and unrelated. Like she's trying to give me the dignity of not making it a conversation. She paused. I needed this job. I need a job. and I've been in enough lobbies and boardrooms in the past year to know exactly what they look like when someone like me walks in. Elliot said, "What do you mean by someone like me?" She looked at him directly. "Someone they're not sure about yet." He held her gaze. "What did you see when you walked into my lobby?" she told him. She was precise and unglamorous about it. The front desk clerk, the concierge staff, the small performance of exclusion that the lobby had been running quietly all afternoon like background music. She told him what she'd noticed about the physical space, about the disconnect between the property's aesthetic ambitions and its operational warmth. She told him the things she'd started to say in the lobby before she caught herself. That the problems in a place like this weren't usually the rooms. She talked for 9 minutes. He timed it without being obvious about it. Then she stopped and looked at her portfolio. "I didn't bring any of this to an interview," she said. "This is just what I saw in 90 minutes. Elliot said, "What would you do with it?" She looked up. "If you had the role," he said. "What's the first thing?" She thought for a moment. "I'd spend a week with the staff who've been there the longest. Not the managers. The people who've been making the beds and running the breakfast service for 6-7 years. They know exactly what's wrong. Nobody's asked them." She paused. "The second thing is the accountability gap between how the property presents itself and how it treats the people who don't look like the brochure. That has to be named before it can be fixed, and naming it makes some people uncomfortable, so you have to be willing to let them be uncomfortable." Elliot was quiet for a moment. "The role I'm offering," he said, "is not the one you applied for." She went still. "The Pembroke Grand is going through a full third-party audit starting Monday. I need someone to run a parallel internal assessment, culture, staff accountability, guest experience infrastructure, and bring me findings in 6 weeks. It's contract to start, with a conversion option at the end if we both want to proceed." He paused. "It reports to me directly, not to the regional structure." Dara looked at the table between them. She was doing the math again. He could see it, running through whatever she needed to run through. "Why me?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Because you sat down in a lobby that was trying to make you small and you opened your portfolio," he said. "And then you got up and walked across the room for a woman with too many bags without calculating whether it would cost you anything." He paused. "It did cost you something. I watched it happen. I'm sorry for that." She looked up. Her expression was careful and complicated and real. "I'm not a charity case," she said. "I know," he said. "If you were, I wouldn't be offering you the contract." Something moved in her face. Not softened exactly, more like settled. 6 weeks, she said, "to start." She picked up her pen. "I'll need full access to staff records, scheduling history, and the complaint logs, including the ones that weren't formally documented. Sandra will get you whatever you need. And I'll talk to the long-tenured staff first, before the audit team gets in and makes people defensive. That can be arranged." She wrote something in the portfolio. Then she looked up. "Okay," she said. The audit ran for 7 weeks, not 6. Dara had asked for the extra week to finalize the staff accountability framework she'd built in parallel, which she presented to Elliot on a Tuesday morning, in a document that was 32 pages long, and did not waste a single one of them. Heather was reassigned, not terminated, reassigned to a back-office administrative function where her interactions with guests were limited and where her performance would be formally reviewed on a 90-day cycle. The front desk clerk, who had directed the family to the side entrance, was placed on a performance improvement plan with specific, measurable benchmarks. Both of them knew why. The documentation made it unmistakable. The long-tenured staff, the ones who had been making beds and running the breakfast service for years, were convened in a room on a Thursday afternoon and asked what they knew. It took about 4 minutes for the room to stop being polite and start being honest. Dara had recorded it with their permission. She had listened to it twice more that evening. She presented her findings to Elliot on a Friday. He read the document twice. He asked 3 questions. She answered them without flinching. At the end of the meeting, he said, "The conversion option. I'd like to discuss it." She looked at the table. "I'd like to as well." She became Director of Operations and Culture for the Harlan Group, effective the 1st of the following month. Her first directive was to rebuild the onboarding process for all 11 properties, starting with something she called the baseline document. A one-page articulation of how guests and staff were expected to be treated. Written in plain language, no corporate vocabulary. She wrote the first draft herself. It took 4 hours and 3 revisions. Every property manager got a copy. Every new hire got a copy on their first day. It was not a radical document. It said basic things. That was the point. Dara's sister, Fiona, cried when she heard the news, which Dara told Elliot about 6 weeks later with the tone of someone reporting a weather event. Matter of fact, fond, slightly exasperated. She cried and then immediately texted me a meme. That's her entire emotional range. Elliot had met Fiona once by then, briefly, when she'd stopped by the office to drop off something Dara had forgotten. Fiona had looked around the 31st floor, and then looked at Elliot with an expression that said, "I know exactly who you are and I'm paying attention." He had respected that immediately. 3 months into the new role on a Thursday afternoon, Elliot walked into the Pembroke Grand through the main entrance. He was in a flannel jacket. Different one, green plaid instead of gray. He had the same canvas duffel bag with the same broken zipper. He walked to the center of the lobby and stood for a moment. A woman at the front desk looked up. "Welcome to the Pembroke," she said. "Can I help you?" Her name tag read Brianna. She was relatively new. He could tell from how she carried herself, not yet fully settled into the rhythms of the place. But there was something in how she looked at him, at his jacket, at the duffel bag, at the broken zipper, and then back up at his face that was different from before. Steady. Unhurried. "Just passing through," he said. "I might sit for a bit if that's okay." "Of course," she said. "There's coffee by the seating area. Help yourself." He sat. He watched the lobby for 40 minutes. Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody said anything under their breath. When an older man came through the doors uncertain about where to go, 2 different staff members moved toward him. When a woman asked a question at the concierge station and clearly didn't speak much English, the staff member pulled up something on the desk computer and turned the screen to face her and pointed. Small things, exactly the right things. Elliot sat with his coffee and didn't take any notes. He didn't need to. He just watched. He texted Dara from the lobby. Just 2 words, "It's working." She texted back 4 minutes later, "I know, I walked through on Tuesday. Brianna is going to be very good." He smiled at his phone in a way that the lobby cameras probably caught, and that he did not particularly mind. The things that changed after that were gradual, and then all at once, the way most things are. There was a night in February, 7 months after the lobby conversation, when Dara's old apartment lease ended, and she hadn't yet found a new place, and she spent 4 days on Fiona's couch, in which Fiona assigned to Elliot as though delivering intelligence of national importance. He told Dara carefully that there was a spare room in his building if she needed somewhere short-term, and she had looked at him for a long moment and said, "That's not a short-term offer, is it?" And he had said truthfully, "No, it's not." She had said she needed to think about it. She thought about it for 6 days. Then she said yes. It wasn't a grand announcement. There was no lobby, no marble floor, no assembled staff. There was a Wednesday evening, a kitchen table, leftovers from a place nearby that did extremely good butter chicken, and Fiona on video call insisting on being present for what she called the part where you two finally stopped being professional about it. Dara told her to hang up. Fiona did not hang up. Elliot thought about what his father had said from a hospital bed in a room that smelled like antiseptic, and the particular quiet of late nights. Watch what people do when it's inconvenient. That's the only version of a person that's real. He had been watching. He had found exactly one person who kept being real no matter what the room cost her. He did not have a ring in his pocket. He had not planned any of this for a Wednesday night, with leftovers, and Fiona on video call, with her face very close to the camera. But he had learned a long time ago that the important moments didn't ask for your calendar availability. He looked at Dara across the kitchen table. She looked back. "I don't have a speech," he said. "Good," she said. "I don't need one. He stopped. "Found it. You walked into my worst performing property in a coat that was too big for you, and you saw exactly what was wrong with it in 90 minutes. And then you fixed it, and somewhere in between I stopped paying attention to the property." She was quiet. "I'd like to stop pretending that's a professional relationship," he said, "if you want the same thing." Fiona, on the video call screen propped against the fruit bowl, made a sound that was not quiet. Dara looked at the screen and said, "I will end this call." Fiona said, "Say yes first." Dara looked back at Elliot. "Yes," she said. Fiona said something jubilant that neither of them fully heard, because Dara had reached over and turned the phone face down. There was a folding chair in the corner of Elliot's office on the 31st floor. An old one, wooden, with a slightly uneven leg that made it wobble if you sat in it wrong. It had been his father's, dragged from the original Thunder Bay Motel office through 3 buildings and 11 properties. His staff had offered to replace it more than once. He'd always said no. Dara had asked about it once, early on, when she was still getting the measure of the office. He'd told her where it came from. She'd nodded, studied it for a moment, and then gone back to what she was doing. She had never mentioned replacing it. He noticed that. The Pembroke Grand won a regional hospitality award the following spring, not for its rooms or its restaurant, which were both excellent, but for guest experience. The submission had been Dara's idea. The write-up was hers too, a document that was honest about what the property had been, and direct about what it had chosen to become. Brianna, the front desk woman who had offered Elliot coffee without looking at his coat, was promoted to floor supervisor 8 months after she was hired. Dara had put the recommendation forward in a review meeting and made her case in about 2 minutes. Elliot had approved it without needing the full 2 minutes. The baseline document, the 1-page plain language statement that Dara had drafted in 4 hours, became standard across all 11 Harlan properties. New hires got it on day 1. It said what it said, plainly, and it said it to everyone the same way, which was the whole point. Fiona visited the Pembroke once, officially, on the grounds of reviewing it for a travel piece she was writing, though the travel piece was for a blog that had 47 subscribers. She walked through the lobby and the breakfast room, and stopped by the front desk and talked to 2 different staff members for about 8 minutes each. Then she found Elliot in the corner of the lobby, which was where he spent a disproportionate amount of his time. "It's good," she said, simply, with the tone of someone who had been paying attention and now had her verdict. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him in the direct way she had, the way that said she was older than him in some ways that had nothing to do with years. "You should know," she said, "that she doesn't do anything halfway. Not the job. Not anything." "I know," he said. "Good," said Fiona. She went to get breakfast. The lobby of the Pembroke Grand on a Thursday morning in late April. Marble floors, tall windows, light coming through in long slanted lines. A bellhop helping a couple with 3 suitcases and a look that said, "I've got you." A family at the front desk, one of the kids pressing both hands flat on the counter to see over it, and the clerk leaning forward to talk to the kid directly instead of over their head. Dara was in the corner with a coffee watching. She came through properties the way Elliot did, quietly, in whatever she happened to be wearing, making notes in her head before she made them anywhere else. She had learned it from him, or maybe she had always done it, and they had recognized each other partly because of it. Elliot sat down beside her. She didn't look over. She said, "The morning shift has gotten very good. I saw. That's because of Brianna's floor meetings. She started doing them twice a week, 15 minutes before open. No agenda, just, what are we seeing, what's working, what isn't?" She paused. "I didn't suggest that. She came up with it herself. That's why you promoted her. That's why I promoted her." They sat with their coffees in the corner of a lobby that smelled like good coffee, and whatever flowers the front desk had put out that morning. Staff moved through the space around them with the quiet efficiency of people who knew what they were doing and why. A door opened and a guest came through and was greeted before he'd taken 3 steps. Nobody looked at their coats. Nobody made any calculations about who mattered and who didn't. The work showed you what it needed, if you listened. The people showed you who they were, if you watched. And the ones who did the right thing when it cost them something, those were the ones who stayed, who built things, who made the whole enterprise worth having in the first place. Elliot looked at Dara beside him. She was writing something in her portfolio, pen moving in small, careful strokes, already on to the next thing. He did not interrupt her. He just stayed.